The last text I received from my mother-in-law before the funeral was sent at 11:47 a.m. on a Saturday. My wife's service began at 2 p.m. The text said, "We're so sorry, honey. Celebrate her for us." My wife had been in hospice for 11 days. They had 11 days to arrange a ride, book a flight, reschedule one party. They chose the party. I found out later there were 43 people at my brother's birthday celebration that afternoon. Rented venue. Catered. A photo booth. I know this because the photos were posted publicly on Facebook at 3:18 p.m. while the pastor was still speaking. While I was still standing at the grave. My name is Renata. I am a licensed estate planning attorney. I have spent 14 years preparing documents that make quiet, binding decisions on behalf of people who are no longer alive to speak for themselves. I know exactly what paper can do to a room full of people who assumed they were safe. This is a story about what my wife left behind, what my family assumed was theirs, and the 11 days that changed every number I'd ever agreed to. Welcome to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts, and family learns that assumptions are not the same as agreements. If you've ever been the person who showed up so consistently that people forgot showing up was a choice, drop a comment and subscribe. You already know what this channel is about. I need to tell you who Elena was before I tell you what happened after. She was a landscape architect. She designed green spaces for hospitals, courtyards and rooftop gardens where people who were dying could sit in sunlight. She believed, with a practicality I always found moving, that every person who was suffering deserved to see something growing. She said it once at a dinner party, and the table went quiet for a second. That was Elena. She said things that required a pause. We met when I was 31, at a continuing education seminar on trust law that she had no professional reason to attend. She later told me she'd signed up because she thought it said trust law, which was a misread of the flyer, and she was already there so she stayed. She sat 2 rows ahead of me and took more notes than anyone in the room. I thought, whoever you are not leaving without talking to me. We were together for 9 years. Married for 6 of them. My family, my parents, my brother Dominic, his wife Carla, my Aunt Phyllis. They liked Elena the way people like a piece of furniture that fits nicely in a room. She was warm. She remembered birthdays. She brought good wine. She never complained when family gatherings ran 4 hours past the stated end time, which they always did, because my family does not have a concept of a stated end time. I was the attorney in the family, which meant I was the one who reviewed leases, caught errors in medical bills, helped my parents refinance their home in 2019, and saved them approximately $14,000 in closing costs. I did not keep a tally. I was not keeping a tally. I want to be clear about that. I was not keeping a tally at the time. Elena kept a garden. On the south side of our house, against the fence, she grew things I could not name and things I could. Rosemary, lavender. A fig tree she'd dragged home in a 5-gallon pot and planted herself, saying it would take 3 years to fruit, and she was right. It took exactly 3. She had that quality. Patient. Systematic. She believed in things she couldn't see yet. When she was diagnosed, aggressive, fast-moving, the kind of cancer that doesn't ask permission. She spent 1 weekend crying. 1. Then she called her own attorney. She made a list. She prepared. She was, in that way, the most like me of anyone I'd ever loved. 11 months from diagnosis to hospice. 11 days in hospice. She knew what was happening. We both did. We said what needed to be said. And then she was gone, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with the window open and the fig tree visible from the bed. I called my parents first. I called Dominic second. His wife Carla answered and said, "Oh God, poor thing, will be there." And I thought she meant at the hospital, and I said no, she's already gone. I mean the service, Saturday at 2. Carla said, "Oh, right. We'll figure it out." I should have heard it then. I was an estate attorney. I knew what "we'll figure it out" sounded like, when someone had already figured out no. The funeral home asked me for a count, so they could arrange seating. I said 40. I was being generous with myself. 19 people attended. My parents were not there. My brother Dominic was not there. His wife Carla was not there. My Aunt Phyllis was not there. Elena's closest cousin, who had flown in from Portland, stood beside me at the graveside. Elena's work colleagues. 2 neighbors. Her therapist, who came on her own time. Our friend Marcus, who drove 4 hours and didn't tell me until he was already in the parking lot. Elena's mother had died years before we met. Her father had remarried and they were estranged. There was no one on her side waiting to fill those pews. There were 4 empty rows in the center of that chapel. I noted this the way I note things in a deposition, with a specific, practiced numbering. 4 rows. 6 chairs per row. 24 chairs. I was standing at the front of the room, and I could see every empty seat, and I understood, with the professional part of my brain, that this was a document. Not one I had prepared, but one I would use. I did not cry at the service. I spoke. I said the things that were true. I described the fig tree. I read one paragraph from a letter Elena had written me the month before she died. Not because she knew she was dying, but because she wrote letters regularly, the way some people keep journals, and I had a stack of them in the nightstand, and this one had felt, reading it afterward, like she'd known anyway. She wrote, "I think the kindest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear." I folded the letter. I sat down. My phone had 14 missed calls and 9 texts by the time I got to the reception. They ranged from thinking of you to "we're so sorry" to a voice message from my mother that said, voice thick and rehearsed, "Renata, I hope it was beautiful. Dominic's thing ran longer than expected. You know how these things go." I know how these things go. I saved every message with timestamps. Screenshot. Save. Repeat. 14 years of legal practice, and the habit doesn't distinguish between work and grief. It just runs. I sat with Marcus that night, and he asked me how I was doing, and I told him I didn't know yet. I had Elena's letter in my jacket pocket. I had my phone in my hand. I had a folder open in my mind labeled "What Happens Next," and I was not yet ready to open it. But I knew the folder was there. Elena's attorney called me 8 days after the service. His name was Gerald Marsh. He had prepared her estate documents personally, at Elena's request, without my involvement. She had been clear about that with him. Renata is not to be a part of this process. She wasn't hiding anything from me. She explained this to me once, quietly, about 6 months before the hospice, when I asked if she needed help with her affairs. She said, "You've spent your whole career making sure other people's paperwork is in order. Let someone do it for you, just this once." I had not pressed. Gerald Marsh's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. He was 72 years old, silver-haired, the kind of attorney who still used a fountain pen and meant it. He had a box of tissues on his desk and a bowl of hard candies, which I have always thought of as the private practice version of a bedside manner. He placed a folder in front of me. Elena had a life insurance policy I knew about. We'd structured it together when we married. $320,000, with me as primary beneficiary. Standard. I knew this number. What I did not know was the second policy. Elena had taken out an additional policy 2 years after her diagnosis, with her own independent funds. She had named me as sole beneficiary. The payout was $180,000. Gerald let me read it twice before he spoke. Then he said, "There's one more thing." Elena had also owned, outright and free of any shared title, a piece of land in upstate New York. She had inherited it from her mother and never mentioned it in any of our joint financial conversations. Not as evasion, I understood immediately, but as privacy. It was hers. 42 acres. A modest structure on the property. Appraised the prior December at $308,000. She had left it to me. She had also left, Gerald said, a letter of instruction that named specific items she wished to be donated, specific wishes for the garden at our home, and a sealed personal note for me, which he handed over in an envelope she had addressed in her own handwriting. I did not open it in his office. Gerald said carefully. Elena anticipated there might be some family complications following her death. She was very specific about the structure of these documents. She asked me to make sure you understood. There is no ambiguity. There are no secondary provisions. Everything she had, she directed to you. I asked him one question. I said, "Is there anything here that requires family notification?" He said no. I said, "Then I'll be in touch." I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. I did not go inside yet. I held Elena's envelope in both hands and I looked at the fig tree through the windshield. You could see the top of it over the fence from the driveway if you knew to look, and I thought, she planned this. Not the dying. The after. I opened the letter. She had written 3 pages. I will not read them here. But the last line was this. You were never the person who needed to prove anything. You just needed to stop paying for people who'd already made their choice. I read it 4 times. Then I went inside and I called my attorney. Not Gerald, but my own colleague, a litigator named Diane, whom I have worked with for 9 years and who has never once told me to calm down, because she has never once seen me not calm. I said, I need demand letters drafted. I'll send you the figures. Diane said, should I ask why? I said, my parents loaned money to my brother twice in the last 6 years. I drew up both notes. He has made no payments. My wife died and they didn't come to the funeral because of his birthday party. I'd like the notes called due. There was a pause. Diane said, I'll need the executed copies. I already had them scanned. I should explain the notes, because this is where the professional lens becomes important. In 2018, my parents gave my brother Dominic $42,000 to help him and Carla purchase their home. He asked me to structure it as a loan with formal documentation. He said this was to protect the family relationship, to keep things clean. I drew up the promissory note. My parents signed it. Dominic signed it. 5% interest. No payments had been made in 4 years. In 2021, my parents gave Dominic an additional $28,000 when he lost his job. Same structure. Same request. I drafted it. Everyone signed it. 12 months balloon payment. Not a single dollar had been paid. My parents had never demanded repayment. They had referred to both transactions at various family dinners as the loans, with a tone that suggested they were more theoretical than actual. The way families do, the way people confuse love with a forgiven balance. I had drafted both documents. I had copies of both documents. Those documents were not theoretical.
Total outstanding principal, $72,000.
Total with accrued interest as of that April. $81,420. My parents had not come to my wife's funeral. My brother had not come to my wife's funeral. The Facebook photos from the birthday party, which I had saved as screenshots, timestamp, 3:18 p.m., the day of the service, showed them laughing, Dominic with a drink raised, Carla with her arm around my mother. The note from my parents to Dominic named my father as lender. My father had passed 2 years prior. The estate, under my mother's authority, now held the debt. I had been named executor of my father's estate. I want to say that again simply. I was the executor. I had standing. I called it in. Diane sent the demand letters on a Thursday. Certified mail, return receipt. My mother's copy, Dominic's copy. 60 days to cure. Full amount due. I was told later that Dominic received his letter on a Tuesday and called my mother within the hour. I was told that my mother's first response was, that can't be right. Renata wouldn't. She hadn't understood, in 9 years of watching me work, that I wouldn't was never a feature of my professional vocabulary. Only I have and I will, and here is the documentation. If you have ever watched someone assume that your patience was the same thing as their permission, if you have ever been the person who drew up the paperwork and then been expected to forget what the paperwork said, you already know exactly where this is going. Stay with me. We're not done. My mother called on a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the letters arrived. She did not lead with the letters. She led with grief. Her voice was careful, shaped, the voice she used when she needed something and wanted me to feel guilty for noticing. She said she missed Elena. She said she wished things had been different on that day. She said, you have to understand, Renata, Dominic had been planning this for months. We couldn't just. I let her finish. Then I said, Mom, I'm not calling about the funeral. She went quiet. I said, I'm calling because Dad's estate holds 2 promissory notes that are past due. As executor, I'm required to pursue collection. Diane's firm represents the estate. Any questions should go through her. She said, Renata, we are your family. I said, the notes were signed by family. That doesn't change what they are. She said some other things after that. I won't recount all of them. The phrase, after everything we've done, appeared at least twice. So did the phrase, Elena would not have wanted this, which I found particularly interesting, given that the people saying it had not been present at any point during Elena's dying. I said, I'll let Diane know you called. Dominic came to my house the following Sunday, without calling ahead. I know the time because my security camera logged it. 2:14 p.m. He knocked. I was home. I watched him on my phone for 45 seconds before I answered the door. He was composed when I opened it. He said he just wanted to talk. He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once, at my own expense, hosted his rehearsal dinner because the venue he'd booked had fallen through, and he said, Renata, you know Mom and Dad always intended to forgive those loans. We all knew that. It was always going to be forgiven. I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked him my one question. I said, is that what the documents say? He didn't answer. I said, because I wrote those documents, Dominic. I know what they say. He tried several other routes after that. He said the timing was cruel. He said I was letting grief make decisions for me. He said Elena would have been embarrassed by this. He said it with the confidence of a man who had not attended her funeral. I stood up. I said, I think you should go. He said, are you actually going to do this? I said, it's already done. Diane sent the letters 3 weeks ago. He left. I sat back down at the kitchen table, and I looked at my hands for a moment. I was not shaking. I noticed that I was not shaking the way you notice an absence. A space where something expected didn't appear. Calm is not the same as weak. My family had been confusing those 2 things for 38 years. That was the last time they would make that mistake. I called Diane. I told her the conversation had taken place. I told her the estate's position had not changed. She said, good. Anything else? I said, have them served if we don't receive payment in the window. She said, already calendared. 3 weeks before the 60-day window closed, my Aunt Phyllis, my father's sister, who had also not attended the service, organized what she called a family meeting. She texted me directly. She said it was time to come together and sort this out like adults. She named a date. A Sunday. My parents' house. I said I would come. I prepared a folder. Inside, the 2 original promissory notes, the Facebook screenshots with timestamps, the funeral home seating chart with the empty rows marked, the certified mail receipts confirming delivery of the demand letters, a printout of the interest calculation as of that date, and Elena's letter. Not the full letter. 1 page. The last page. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in late June. The fig tree at my house was producing by then. The first real harvest since Elena planted it. I had picked 4 figs that morning. I put one in my jacket pocket before I left. I don't know entirely why. I just did. My mother, Dominic, Carla, and Phyllis were seated in the living room when I arrived. There was a 5th chair slightly set apart, facing the rest. They had arranged the room. Phyllis began. She is 71 years old, and ran a real estate office for 30 years. And she has the delivery of a woman who has closed many negotiations she had no business winning. She said she understood I was grieving. She said she understood the family had failed me on the day of the service. She used the word failed. She deserved credit for that. She said, but these notes have never been treated as real obligations. She said, your father wouldn't have wanted this. She said, this is family money. She talked for approximately 4 minutes. The room nodded. Carla was crying. Dominic had his arms crossed. Phyllis finished and looked at me. I said, may I respond? She gestured, go ahead. I opened the folder. I said, I'd like to start with the notes themselves, because I think there's been some confusion about what they actually say. I placed the first note on the coffee table. I read the key terms aloud: the principal, the interest rate, the payment schedule, the signature line. I read Dominic's signature back to him. I placed the second note beside it. Carla said, "Renata, this feels really aggressive." I said, "This is what the documents say. I drew them up. I have the originals." My mother said, "Your father never intended." I placed the Facebook screenshots on the table. I said, "This is from the afternoon of Elena's service. The timestamp is 3:18 p.m. The service concluded at 3:45. These photos were posted publicly." The room changed. Not loudly. Just changed. The kind of shift you can feel in a negotiation when a party realizes the other side has more than they showed in opening. Dominic said louder now, "You're going to use a Facebook photo to justify coming after your own family?" I said, "I'm not justifying anything. I'm demonstrating sequence. You chose not to come. That is documented. I called in a debt I have legal standing to call. That is also documented. I haven't made any claims about causation. I'm just showing you what exists." Carla said, "Elena would never." I took the last page of Elena's letter from the folder. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when someone produces a document no one knew existed. I said, "Elena wrote me a letter. I'd like to read one line of it." I read it. "You were never the person who needed to prove anything. You just needed to stop paying for people who'd already made their choice." I put the letter back in the folder. Phyllis said quietly, "And I give her this, she was the only one who said anything worth keeping," she said. "We should have been there." I looked at her. I said, "Yes." That was all. Dominic made one more run. He said if I pursued the notes to judgment, he'd countersue for the legal fees he claimed I'd caused. I did not raise my voice. I said, "That's Diane's department. I'll let her know." My mother began to cry. Genuinely, not performed. I watched her and I did not move toward her and I did not move away. I just stood. I picked up my folder. I reached into my jacket pocket. I placed the fig on the coffee table. Elena had grown that tree. It had taken 3 years to fruit. I set it down and I did not explain it, and no one asked. I said, "I'll see myself out." Dominic paid. Not in full, he couldn't. But he entered into a structured repayment agreement, drafted by Diane, notarized, with a payment schedule and a default clause. The first payment arrived 14 days after our meeting. It has continued to arrive monthly. As of now, he has repaid $53,000 of the $81,420 owed. My mother did not speak to me for 62 days. When she called again, she was different. Not apologetic, exactly, but quieter. We exist now in a territory I don't have a word for. Not estrangement, not warmth. Honest maybe. Which is something we were not before. Phyllis sent a card. Just a card. She wrote, "I should have been there. I'm sorry." That was all. I kept the card. I didn't need more from her. It was enough that it was true. Carla I do not hear from. That is fine. The money from Elena's second life insurance policy, the one I didn't know about, the one she had arranged quietly on her own. I used a portion of it to fund a small endowment with a local hospice organization. They use it to maintain a rooftop garden where patients can sit. It was not named after Elena at my request. She would not have wanted her name on a plaque. She just would have wanted there to be a garden. The land in upstate New York, I drove up in September. 42 acres. A small structure that needs work. A creek in the northeast corner. I walked the whole property in one afternoon, and I thought about what she'd said in the letter. Refused to disappear. I have not decided what to do with it yet. But I have stopped making decisions on other people's timelines. The fig tree produced 17 figs that first season. I made preserves. I labeled the jars in her handwriting. I found a card she'd written me years ago and I traced the letters onto paper labels, one by one. I gave a jar to Marcus. I kept the rest. The folder from the meeting lives in my filing cabinet, in a section labeled Estate, Personal. I take it out sometimes. Not often. But sometimes I open it and I look at the promissory notes and I think about all the documents I've drawn up in my career. All the paper that says, this is what we agreed. This is what it cost to walk away. Elena was right. I had been paying an invoice I'd never signed. I had been, for years, the person who showed up. To the holidays, to the emergencies, to the refinancings, to the drafting tables. I had been paying with presence and expertise and time. Into a family account that only ran in one direction. And I had been so busy showing up that I hadn't noticed the balance. She noticed. She prepared. She left me the tools. And then she stepped back and trusted me to use them. Quiet is not absence. Patience is not permission. And the people who confuse your calm for compliance will eventually learn the difference. Not from a speech, but from a document. If this story reminded you that dignity doesn't require an audience, that the receipts don't lie even when the people do, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Name what's been left unnamed. And if you know someone who's been the one who always shows up while others never do, send this to them. Drop a comment. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.